The gavel struck 3 times. Each impact echoed through the federal courtroom like a death knell for everything Cordelia Ashworth Vane had spent 15 years building. Judge Everly Prescott fixed her gaze on the woman in the light blue suit, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute finality. Mrs. Ashworth Vane, based on the evidence presented, this court finds Silvervale Summit Estates, HOA, liable for 127 counts of fraud, trespass, and water theft spanning 15 years. 400 people packed into that courtroom held their breath. I watched Cordelia's perfectly manicured hands grip the defendant's table so hard her knuckles went white. The strand of South Sea pearls around her neck trembled with each shallow breath she took. Her platinum blonde hair, usually swept back with surgical precision, had begun to escape its pins. The entire subdivision, Judge Prescott continued, her words landing like hammer blows, was built on land illegally obtained from the Caldwell family through forged documents and fraudulent conveyances. All titles derived from the 1989 deed are hereby declared void. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Somewhere behind me, a woman started crying. Cordelia swayed slightly, and for one satisfying moment, I thought she might actually faint. Mr. Caldwell, the judge turned to me, is hereby recognized as the rightful owner of the underlying land. Consequently, all 127 existing property deeds within Silvervale Summit Estates are declared invalid due to the fraudulent conveyance. 3 weeks ago, this same woman had stood on my porch, waving a stack of violation notices in my face like weapons. Her voice had dripped with contempt as she delivered her ultimatum. You have 72 hours to pay $100,000 in fines or vacate. This is my lake, my neighborhood. You are nothing but a squatter on premium real estate. I had said nothing, just smiled. The smile my former colleagues at the Federal Water Rights Division used to call the coffin smile, because it meant someone was about to lose everything. Cordelia had no idea who she was threatening that day. She had no idea that I had spent 16 years dismantling empires far more sophisticated than hers. She had no idea that by targeting my daughter, she had transformed a simple property dispute into a war of annihilation. But to understand how 127 millionaire families came to owe me rent, we need to go back 3 weeks. Back to the day I first drove through the rusted gates of Caldwell Ranch and discovered exactly what my grandfather had left me. The dirt road wound through 70-year-old lodgepole pines that no GPS could find. My pickup truck bounced over ruts that hadn't been maintained in decades, and beside me, Marlo sat with her headphones around her neck, pretending to focus on her iPad while stealing glances out the window every few seconds. "Dad," she said suddenly, "the road just ended." I stopped the truck. Through the dusty windshield, a weathered sign emerged from the overgrowth. Caldwell Ranch, private property, no trespassing. The letters had faded to ghosts of their original bold black, but they were still legible, still defiant. 18 months since Clara passed. 18 months of sleepless nights and cross-country moves and trying to convince a 16-year-old that life would eventually stop hurting so much. This was the first moment since the funeral that I felt like I could actually breathe. The cabin appeared after the next curve, and Marlo's breath caught audibly. 2 stories of hand-hewn cedar logs rose against a backdrop that looked like it had been painted by someone who thought reality needed more color. Silvervale Lake stretched out before us, its surface so still it mirrored the snow-capped mountains perfectly. The water shifted between shades of turquoise and emerald, depending on how the afternoon light hit it. "Mom would have loved this," Marlo whispered. The words hit me like a physical blow. Clara used to say that someday we would find a place where the world could not touch us. I never found it for her, but maybe I could find it for our daughter. While Marlowe explored the cabin's interior, exclaiming over the stone fireplace and the view from the upstairs loft, I retrieved the lockbox that the estate lawyer had couriered to our motel the night before. My grandfather, Emmett Caldwell, had died 3 months ago at the age of 94. I had never met him. My father had left Montana before I was born and never spoke about his family. The inheritance came as a complete surprise, delivered by a lawyer who seemed almost relieved to finally locate me. Inside the lockbox, I found 3 items that would change everything. The first was a survey map dated 1934, showing the original Caldwell Ranch boundaries in meticulous detail. 847 acres, including the entirety of Silvervale Lake and all surrounding shoreline. The second was a federal water rights certificate from 1952, designating Silvervale Lake as a navigable waterway under federal jurisdiction. The certificate bore the seal of the Army Corps of Engineers. The third was a handwritten letter in my grandfather's shaky script. When you read this, someone will have tried to take what belongs to our family. Use what your father taught you. I have been waiting 60 years for someone who would know how to fight back. I read the letter 3 times. My father had died when I was 22, but before that, he had spent my entire childhood teaching me about water rights, property law, and the Byzantine regulations governing federal waterways. I always assumed it was just his passion. Now I understood it was preparation. 16 years at the Federal Water Rights Division. 47 cases. 47 convictions. My father had been training me for this my entire life without ever telling me why. The sound of engines shattered the afternoon silence. Not cars. Something smaller. Electric. I stepped onto the porch just as 3 white golf carts emerged from a trail on the north side of the property. According to the survey map I had just been studying, there should not have been any trail there. There should not have been any access to my land from that direction at all. The woman who stepped out of the lead cart moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything in sight. Her light blue suit was tailored to perfection, not a single wrinkle despite the rough terrain. A strand of pearls that probably cost more than my truck caught the sunlight. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disdain. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume?" Her voice was honey poured over broken glass. "I am Cordelia Ashworth Vane, president of Silvervale Summit Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your situation." 2 men flanked her. One carried a clipboard thick with papers. The other held what looked like a surveyor's transit, though I doubted he knew how to use it. "My situation?" I kept my voice neutral. 16 years of depositions had taught me the value of letting opponents talk themselves into corners. Cordelia gestured toward the lake with a sweep of her arm that suggested she was presenting her personal property. "This lake has been Silvervale Summit's amenity for 23 years. Our residents pay premium fees for exclusive access. Your cabin sits on what we consider community waterfront." I let the silence stretch. She filled it, as I knew she would. "I have here a comprehensive list of violations." She nodded to the man with the clipboard, who stepped forward and thrust papers toward me. "Unauthorized structure on HOA adjacent land. Failure to register with community management. Blocking established recreational easement. Inadequate landscaping maintenance. Improper exterior paint colors." "Easement," I interrupted, taking the papers but not looking at them. "You mentioned an established easement." "Of course. The community has used this waterfront for over 2 decades. An easement requires 2 things, Mrs. Ashworth Vane: a formal agreement between property owners and registration with the county recorder. Could you provide me with the registration number? For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. A micro-expression that 16 years of interrogating fraudsters had taught me to scrutinize instantly. Uncertainty masked by arrogance. The documentation is with our legal team. I understand. When you locate it, please send me a copy. In the meantime, you are standing on private property without permission. I will need to ask you to leave. Cordelia stepped closer. Her perfume was expensive and overwhelming. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something approaching a threat. Mr. Caldwell, you seem to misunderstand how things work here. Silvervale Summit has resources, connections. This community was built by the most powerful families in Montana. You are just one man in a rundown cabin. Think very carefully about your next move. I met her gaze without blinking. I have thought very carefully. That is why I am here. She held my stare for 3 seconds, then 5, then 7. I did not look away. Finally, she turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart. You will be hearing from our attorneys, Mr. Caldwell, and you will regret this conversation. I watched the 3 carts disappear back down the trail that should not have existed. Then I went inside and began making phone calls. The violation notices started appearing 72 hours later. I woke at 6:15 a.m. to find 9 orange papers plastered across my front door, each one more absurd than the last. Unauthorized residential structure on HOA adjacent property, $10,000. Unpermitted dock construction, $5,000. Failure to submit architectural plans, $15,000. Blocking community water access, $20,000. Inadequate exterior maintenance, $3,000. Improper waste disposal, $2,000. Unauthorized vehicle storage, $1,000. Failure to maintain approved landscaping, $4,000. Noise violation, $2,000. Total, $42,000. Payment due in 14 days. I photographed each notice, noting that the cabin did not have a dock, had not produced any noise since my arrival, and had existed on this land for over 60 years before the HOA was even formed. The accusations were not just false. They were evidence of a pattern. Dad? Marlo's voice came from behind me. She stood in the doorway, hair still messy from sleep, studying the orange papers with the analytical expression she had inherited from her mother. Those golf cart tracks from yesterday. They came from the North Trail. She walked past me and pointed to the survey map I had pinned to the wall. Look, their entire subdivision only has one road in. It comes from the south. But those carts came from the opposite direction, through our property, which means they have been using our land as a shortcut. Not just a shortcut. Marlo traced her finger along the map. Look at the topography. The North Trail is the only flat route to the lake. If they cannot use it, they would have to go around the mountain. That is an extra 45 minutes each way. I stared at my daughter. 16 years old, grieving her mother, uprooted from everything she knew, and she had just identified the leverage point I had been looking for. Mom would have noticed too, she said quietly, then turned and walked back inside. The words hung in the air long after she had gone. Clara had been the strategist in our family. She could look at any situation and find the angle no one else saw. For a moment, standing on that porch surrounded by fraudulent violation notices, I could almost hear her voice telling me exactly what to do next. That afternoon, I drove the perimeter of the ranch. What I found confirmed every suspicion. 3 separate trails cut through my property, all showing heavy use. 2 boat launches had been constructed on my shoreline, complete with permanent dock structures. A pump station sat 50 meters from the lake, with pipes running directly toward the HOA subdivision. Someone had installed electrical conduits, water lines, and gravel paths across land that did not belong to them. They had not just been trespassing. They had built infrastructure. They had treated my grandfather's land as their own for over 2 decades. I took 240 photographs, GPS tagged every location, documented every structure. 16 years of federal investigation work had taught me that the difference between winning and losing often came down to the quality of your evidence file. The county recorder's office opened at 8 a.m. I arrived at 7:45, which gave me time to notice the black sedan that had followed me from the ranch. It parked across the street and did not move. The clerk was a woman in her 50s named Opal. She looked at me with something between sympathy and warning when I gave her the property address. Silvervale Lake? She lowered her voice even though we were alone. Honey, you are not the first person to come asking about that. You will not be the last either. Others have asked? 3 families in the past 7 years. All of them sold their properties to Mrs. Ashworth Vane's husband within 6 months, below market value. She slid a request form across the counter. Be careful with what you find. 2 hours later, I sat in a back room surrounded by boxes of property records spanning 40 years. The smoking gun appeared in a file dated 1989. A survey map showed Silvervale Summit's boundaries beginning at the lakeshore. But the original 1952 survey, the one matching my grandfather's documents, showed the HOA boundary starting 300 meters back from the water. Someone had redrawn the lines. Someone had erased 300 meters of shoreline from Caldwell Ranch and added it to the subdivision. The 1989 map bore 2 signatures. One belonged to Harmon Ashworth, listed as the surveyor of record. The second was supposedly my grandfather's authorization, except I had samples of my grandfather's handwriting from the letter in the lockbox. The signature on the 1989 map was not even close. 300 meters of shoreline multiplied by the lake's circumference equaled 173 acres of stolen land. At current Montana prices, that represented approximately $12 million in property theft. But that was only the beginning. I pulled additional records. The company that built Silvervale Summit was called Vane Development LLC. Registered owner, Thaddeus Vane, Cordelia's husband. The company that supplied water to the HOA was Silvervale Utilities. Registered through a shell company in Delaware that traced back to the same Vane Development LLC. They had been selling water from my lake to 127 families at $500 per month. For 23 years. 127 households times $500 times 12 months times 23 years equaled just under $17 million. $17 million stolen from my family. I photographed everything. Then I photographed it again with a different camera. Then I requested certified copies of every document, paying the fees in cash so there would be no electronic record of my inquiry. The black sedan was still parked across the street when I left. It followed me all the way back to the ranch. The letter from Kingsworth & Associates arrived on day 5. The law firm occupied the top floor of the tallest building in Helena, which told me everything I needed to know about their billing rates. Dear Mr. Caldwell, the letter began. Our client, Silvervale Summit Homeowners Association, has authorized legal action regarding your continued obstruction of established community rights. You have 72 hours to comply with the following demands. 1. pay outstanding fines totaling $67,000. 2. Sign an easement agreement granting permanent community access to the lake. 3. Remove all unauthorized structures from the waterfront zone. Failure to comply will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings and potential criminal charges for interference with water rights. $67,000. The fines had increased by $25,000 in less than a week. "They are scared," Marlo said without looking up from her laptop. "What makes you say that?" "They are moving too fast. Mom always said people who know they are right take their time. People who know they are wrong try to end things before anyone can look too close." I looked at my daughter, hunched over her computer, in a cabin that smelled like cedar and old memories. 16 years old. Lost her mother. Been dragged across 3 states in 18 months. And she was still sharper than most adults I had worked with in federal service. "Mom would be proud of you. Mom would tell you to stop being sentimental and start fighting back." She finally looked up, and for a moment Clara was staring at me through her eyes. "So what are you waiting for?" That night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Sutton, my former colleague at the Water Rights Division. "I need you to pull every filing Vane development ever made. Title chains, permit applications, environmental assessments, everything." The second was to Birch, an independent surveyor I had worked with on the Wyoming water theft case. "I need someone clean, no connections to Montana. Someone who can survey 800 acres and testify in federal court." The third call was to Agent Comstock at the FBI field office in Billings. "Remember the Redstone fraud case? I found something bigger. Interstate wire fraud, forged federal documents, and about 300 victims who do not know they are victims yet." Day 7 began at 5:15 a.m. with Marlo screaming. I was out of bed and through the cabin before my mind fully registered what was happening. She stood on the porch, still in her pajamas, pointing toward the lake. The dock was gone. Not removed. Destroyed. The wooden structure that my grandfather had built with his own hands, the only original improvement left on the property, had been sawed through at the water line. Pieces of it floated on the morning-still surface of the lake like the corpse of something beautiful. On one of the remaining posts, someone had attached a laminated sign. "Unauthorized structure removed per HOA regulation 12.7. I called 911. Then I called the personal number on the card. Deputy Finch had slipped me 3 days earlier. Deputy Calder Finch arrived within the hour. 35 years old, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that had seen too much small-town corruption. He examined the destruction without speaking, took photographs, and then walked with me to a spot where Marlo could not hear us. "Mr. Caldwell, I am going to be honest with you." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I have been working in this county for 8 years. Every complaint against the Ashworth Vane family disappears. Every investigation hits a dead end. Judge Harrington golfs with Thaddeus every Sunday. Then why are you telling me this? Because you are the first person who did not back down after the first letter, and because I am tired of watching good people get crushed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn business card. "My personal cell. When things get worse, they will call me." Things got worse that same afternoon. The black SUV pulled up to the cabin at 2:45 p.m. 2 men in ill-fitting suits stepped out, moving with the rehearsed authority of people who were used to intimidating others. "Mr. Caldwell, we are from Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous request for a welfare check regarding the minor residing on this property. Standard procedure requires us to investigate." Marlo. They were using my daughter as a weapon. 16 years of professional restraint. 16 years of keeping my emotions locked down during interrogations of people far worse than Cordelia Ashworth Vane. All of it nearly crumbled in that single moment. But Clara's voice echoed in my memory, clear as the day she first said it. The moment you lose control is the moment they win. I forced my face into professional neutrality. Gentlemen, please come in. I will be happy to show you everything. I will also be documenting this entire visit for the federal complaint I will be filing tomorrow. The CPS agents spent 2 hours inspecting every corner of the cabin. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Marlowe's room was cleaner than most teenagers' spaces. The kitchen was stocked. The utilities worked perfectly. The property, aside from the vandalized dock, was immaculate. But the message had been received. Cordelia Ashworth Vane was willing to destroy a family to protect her empire. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. After the agents left, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a fresh legal pad beside me. Marlowe sat across from me, organizing files on her own computer with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what we were doing. "This is personal now," she said without looking up. "Is that going to be a problem?" "It was personal the moment they mentioned you." "Good." She highlighted something on her screen. "Because I found something interesting. The notary who certified the 1989 survey map, his license was revoked in 1987 for fraud. 2 years before he supposedly witnessed that signature." I stared at her. "Where did you find that?" "Montana State Archives. Digitized professional licensing records." She finally met my eyes. "Mom always said the details matter. I figured someone should be paying attention to them." For a moment, grief and pride and love tangled together in my chest, until I could not separate them. Clara would have been so proud of the young woman our daughter was becoming. "Okay," I said, pulling my laptop closer. "Let us build them a coffin." The next 7 days blurred into a focused marathon of investigation. Sutton's research revealed that Vane Development had applied for no permits whatsoever during the construction of Silver Vale Summit's lakefront facilities. Every dock, every boathouse, every pump station had been built illegally on federal waterway-adjacent land. Birch completed his independent survey, confirming what the original documents showed. The HOA boundary had been fraudulently extended by exactly 173 acres, all of it belonging to the Caldwell Ranch. Agent Comstock called with news that made me smile for the first time in weeks. "We are opening a formal investigation. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. If your evidence holds up, this is RICO territory." But the most important piece came from an unexpected source. Augustus Brennan appeared at my cabin on day 12. 72 years old, with the weathered hands of someone who had spent his life working outdoors and eyes that carried decades of suppressed anger. "You do not know me," he said, standing on my porch like a man delivering a confession. "But I know your grandfather. I was the surveyor who found the boundary discrepancy in 2009. What happened?" "I filed a report. 1 week later, my license was revoked. Misconduct, they said. Falsifying records, charges that came out of nowhere." He pulled a worn USB drive from his pocket. "But I kept copies, everything. Survey data, original measurements, the discrepancy analysis. I have been waiting 13 years for someone who could use it." "Why did you not go to the authorities?" Augustus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The chairman of the Montana Board of Licensure in 2009, Thaddeus Vane's cousin, the county recorder who accepted the fraudulent survey, retired on a suspiciously generous pension. The judge who dismissed the complaints, same one who plays golf with Thaddeus every Sunday." He pressed the USB drive into my hand. They built a system, Mr. Caldwell. A machine for stealing land and crushing anyone who noticed. But machines can be broken. I am hoping you are the one who knows how. By day 14, my cabin had become a war room. Sarah Pemberton, a forensic accountant I had worked with on federal cases, had arrived from Seattle. She spread financial records across the kitchen table like a general mapping enemy positions. Deputy Finch stopped by every evening after his shift, always in civilian clothes, always with new information about internal complaints that had mysteriously vanished from county files. Augustus Brennan had moved into the guest room, spending his days helping Birch verify survey data and his evenings teaching Marlowe the fundamentals of property law. And Marlowe. My 16-year-old daughter had become the operations information architect, organizing hundreds of documents into a searchable database that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. "What do we have?" I asked during our evening briefing. Sarah adjusted her glasses and consulted her notes. 17 million in fraudulent water sales, 8 million in HOA fees diverted to shell companies, 6 million in fake maintenance assessments, plus the underlying land theft, which at current values represents another 12 million. Total exposure? Over $40 million in provable fraud. That is RICO. That is asset forfeiture. That is Cordelia and Thaddeus looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. I walked to the window and stared at the lights of Silver Vale Summit glittering on the hillside across the lake. 127 families living in homes built on stolen land, paying fraudulent fees to people who had been robbing them for decades. "We are not destroying them," I said. "We are freeing them." The next morning brought a final notice from Kingsworth and Associates. The fines had increased to $100,000. I had 48 hours to pay or face immediate foreclosure and eviction. Cordelia was pushing all in, which meant it was time for me to make my move. I called Dorian Kingsworth directly. "Mr. Kingsworth, I would like to propose a settlement. I will pay the fines, but I want a meeting with the full HOA board and all residents. I would like to resolve this publicly, once and for all." Silence on the other end. Then, with barely concealed greed, "You are serious? You will pay $100,000? I will bring a certified check. Tomorrow evening, 8 p.m., the community center." He could not resist. $100,000 plus the chance to humiliate me in front of the entire community? It was too perfect to refuse. "I will make the arrangements," he said. "But Mr. Caldwell, I hope you understand that after tomorrow, there will be no more negotiations. You will comply with all HOA requirements, or you will be removed from this community permanently." "I understand perfectly," I said. "See you tomorrow." I hung up and turned to find Marlowe watching me from the doorway. "You do not actually have a certified check, do you?" "No." She smiled. It was Clara's smile, the one that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Good," she said. "Let us go get ready." The Silver Vale Summit Community Center could hold 300 people comfortably. By 7:45 p.m., over 400 had crammed inside, filling every seat and lining the walls 3 deep. Word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The reclusive cabin owner was finally going to surrender. Cordelia Ashworth Vane was about to claim her ultimate victory. I arrived at 7:55 with Marlowe beside me, carrying a brown leather briefcase that had belonged to my father. The crowd parted as we walked down the center aisle, whispers following us like shadows. Cordelia sat at the head table on a raised platform, flanked by her husband Thaddeus and their lawyer Dorian Kingsworth. She wore a new light blue suit, immaculate as always, her pearls catching the overhead lights with each confident breath. The smile on her face belonged to someone who had already won. "Mr. Caldwell," her voice rang through the microphone, silencing the murmurs instantly. "How gracious of you to finally see reason. Do you have the payment?" I stopped at the front of the room, facing her across 20 feet of polished hardwood floor. Every eye in the building locked onto me. "I have something better." I set the briefcase on the table reserved for me and clicked it open. Inside were not checks or legal documents of surrender. Instead, I pulled out 500 copies of a single page and began passing them down each row. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly without amplification, "what I am about to show you will change everything you think you know about this community." Marlo had already connected her laptop to the projector. The screen behind Cordelia flickered to life, displaying two images side by side. Survey maps. One dated 1952, the other dated 1989. "This," I pointed to the older map, "shows the original property boundaries of Silvervale Lake and surrounding land. As you can see, the HOA boundary begins 300 meters back from the shoreline." I moved my finger to the second map. "And this is what was filed with the county recorder in 1989. Notice anything different?" The room erupted in murmurs. Even from where I stood, I could see people comparing the documents, pointing at the obvious discrepancy. Someone redrew the lines. Someone stole 173 acres of lakefront property from my family by forging my grandfather's signature on a fraudulent survey. I paused, letting the words sink in. The signature was witnessed by a notary whose license had been revoked 2 years earlier for fraud. Cordelia's smile had frozen into something brittle. "This is preposterous. Our legal team has verified every document. This man is clearly attempting to "I am not finished, Mrs. Ashworth Vane." The room went silent at my tone. 16 years of federal courtrooms had taught me how to command attention without raising my voice. Marlo advanced to the next slide. Financial records, bank statements, corporate registration documents. "Your HOA has been paying Silvervale Utilities for water access, $500 per month, per household, for 23 years. I let the math settle over the crowd. That is nearly $140,000 per family. Someone in the back gasped audibly. A man near the front pulled out his phone and started calculating. "And where does that money go?" Another slide. "To Silvervale Utilities, which is owned by a Delaware shell company, which is controlled by Vane Development LLC, which is owned by Thaddeus Vane." I turned to face Cordelia's husband directly. "Your husband has been selling you water from a lake he does not own, water that belongs to my family." Thaddeus Vane had gone the color of old milk. His hands gripped the table edge as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Cordelia shot to her feet. "This is defamation. These are lies fabricated by a man who refuses to follow community rules." "Are they?" I reached into the briefcase and withdrew a thick binder. Federal water rights records, certified bank statements, shell company registrations, corporate filing histories, everything cross-referenced and notarized. I spent 16 years building cases exactly like this one. I have never been wrong. "But how?" Dorian Kingsworth finally found his voice, though it emerged strangled and thin. "How could you possibly have access to all this? You are just some nobody who inherited a rundown cabin." I allowed myself a small smile, the same cold smile I used right before closing a case. "My name is Stetson Caldwell. For 16 years, I served as senior investigator at the Federal Water Rights Division. I have built cases against corporations worth billions. I have testified in federal court 47 times. I locked eyes with Cordelia. I have never lost a single case. The silence that followed was absolute. 400 people held their breath, waiting. You sent Child Protective Services after my daughter, I continued, my voice dropping to something cold and precise. You destroyed my grandfather's dock. You threatened to take land that has belonged to my family for over a century. You built an empire on theft and intimidation, crushing anyone who stood in your way. I stepped closer to the platform, close enough to see the sweat beading on Cordelia's perfectly made-up forehead. And now I am going to take everything you have ever built. Cordelia's face cycled through expressions like a slot machine unable to land on a winning combination. Shock gave way to denial, then rage, then something that looked very much like terror. You cannot prove any of this, she hissed. Our lawyers will bury you in litigation. We have resources you cannot imagine. Your lawyer, I said, turning to Dorian Kingsworth, is the registered agent for the Nevada shell company that receives diverted HOA funds. He is not your legal representative. He is your co-conspirator. Every eye in the room swiveled to Kingsworth. His face had drained of all color, and he looked like a man watching his career implode in real time. "This is a coup!" Cordelia screamed, all pretense of composure abandoned. "Security! Remove this man immediately!" No one moved. 400 people stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to dawning fury. These were her neighbors, her subjects, the people she had been robbing and bullying for over 2 decades. And they were finally seeing the truth. The community center doors opened with a bang that made everyone jump. Deputy Calder Finch walked in first, but he was not alone. Behind him came 5 people in dark suits and FBI windbreakers. Agent Comstock led them, her face set in the grim satisfaction of someone about to make a career-defining arrest. Cordelia Ashworth Vane, Thaddeus Vane, Dorian Kingsworth. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. You are under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the suddenly silent room. Cordelia struggled briefly as an agent guided her arms behind her back, but it was the resistance of someone who had never faced consequences and could not believe they were finally arriving. You have destroyed this community, she spat at me as they led her past. No, I replied calmly. I have freed it. The crowd parted to let the agents through. 400 people watched in stunned silence as their HOA president, her developer husband, and their lawyer were escorted out in handcuffs. Then someone started clapping. A single pair of hands, somewhere near the back. Within seconds, the applause had spread through the entire room, building to a roar that shook the windows. Marlo appeared at my elbow, her face wearing an expression I had not seen since before her mother's diagnosis. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride. Mom would have loved that, she said. She would have done it better, I replied, but I think she would be satisfied with the result. The federal courthouse smelled like old wood and nervous energy. The wheels of justice had ground slowly but with terrifying precision over the past 6 months. It had been a grueling season of depositions, evidence review, and the dismantling of an empire that Cordelia thought was untouchable. Judge Everly Prescott presided over the civil proceedings with the demeanor of someone who had seen everything and was no longer capable of being surprised. She reviewed documents, heard testimony, and asked questions that demonstrated an absolute command of property law and fraud statutes. When she finally delivered her ruling, her voice filled the courtroom with the weight of absolute authority. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that Silvervale Summit Estates was constructed on land obtained through fraudulent conveyance, forged documents, and systematic deception spanning multiple decades. All titles derived from the 1989 survey are hereby declared void. The gallery erupted in panicked whispers. 400 homeowners had just learned that their properties sat on stolen land. Millions of dollars in real estate had become legally uncertain in the span of a single sentence. Judge Prescott raised her hand for silence. However, this court also recognizes that current residents are innocent victims of this fraud. They purchased their homes in good faith, paid their mortgages, and built their lives without knowledge of the underlying crimes. She turned to look at the gallery. The plaintiff has submitted a settlement agreement which allows current residents to remain in their homes under a corrected lease structure. This court has reviewed the terms and finds them equitable. The settlement is hereby ratified. The whispers transformed into something more hopeful. People who had walked into the courtroom terrified of losing everything began to realize they might actually be okay. The lease terms are as follows, Judge Prescott continued. Current residents may remain in their homes indefinitely, paying fair market rent to the Caldwell Family Trust. This rent will be approximately 1/10 of what residents previously paid in combined HOA fees and water charges. Existing mortgages will be restructured to reflect the lease arrangement. She paused to let the math sink in. People were saving money. Substantial money. The system that had been bleeding them dry for decades was being replaced with something fair. Additionally, proceeds from the lease arrangement will be used to establish a restitution fund for previous victims of the Ashworth Vane fraud operation, including 17 families who were coerced into selling their properties below market value. The Silvervale Lake Conservation Trust will be created to restore and maintain the lake according to federal environmental standards. The gavel came down one final time. So ordered. The criminal proceedings concluded 6 months later. I attended every day, watching as the empire Cordelia had built was dismantled piece by piece. The forensic accountants had found everything. Hidden accounts in 3 states. Shell companies layered like nesting dolls. A network of corruption that extended far beyond the HOA into county government, the state licensing board, and the local judiciary. Cordelia Ashworth Vane stood trial on 14 counts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all of them. 18 years in federal prison. $12 million in asset forfeiture. Her light blue suits would be replaced with orange jumpsuits for nearly 2 decades. Thaddeus Vane faced 22 counts. His construction empire, built on stolen land and fraudulent contracts, was dissolved completely. 22 years, no possibility of parole. Dorian Kingsworth received 12 years and permanent disbarment. His prestigious law firm collapsed within weeks of his arrest, as clients fled and partners scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Judge Harrington, who had golfed with Thaddeus every Sunday for 15 years, was removed from the bench and faced his own indictment for obstruction of justice. 7 county officials resigned. 3 more were prosecuted. The machine that Augustus Brennan had described, the system built to steal land and crush opposition, had been dismantled completely. 1 year later, I stood on the new dock that had been built where my grandfather's original structure once stood. The wood was fresh-cut cedar, designed to match the cabin's aesthetic, but the location was exactly the same. Some things were worth preserving. Silvervale Lake sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight, its waters cleaner than they had been in decades thanks to the Conservation Trust's restoration efforts. The illegal pump stations were gone. The unauthorized boathouses had been removed. The shoreline had been returned to something approaching its natural state. Across the lake, the houses of Silvervale Summit still stood. The families were still there, still paying their leases, but something fundamental had changed. The gates that once marked the community's boundaries had been removed. The private roads were now public. The lake that had been hoarded by the wealthy was open to everyone. Augustus Brennan had been reinstated by the state licensing board with a formal apology and back payment for 13 years of lost income. He had opened an environmental education center in his old surveyor's office, teaching young people about land rights and conservation. His waiting had finally paid off. Deputy Finch had been elected sheriff in a landslide after his role in the investigation became public. He had spent the past year reopening cold cases, finding pattern after pattern of corruption that the previous administration had buried. 43 additional fraud cases, 12 more prosecutions, a county transformed. Sarah Pemberton had returned to Seattle, but visited often, helping establish the restitution fund's accounting systems. The 17 families who had been forced to sell their properties below market value had each received settlements averaging over $200,000. Some had used the money to buy back their original homes from the trust at fair prices. And Marlo. My daughter had finished her junior year of high school with straight A's and early acceptance letters from 3 universities. She had decided to study environmental law, combining her mother's analytical mind with her own passion for justice. Clara would have been so proud. "Dad?" Her voice came from the cabin doorway. "There is another envelope. It's from Nevada." I walked up the dock and took the letter from her hands. The return address was a law firm in Reno. The contents made me smile. "What is it?" Marlo asked. "Remember the shell companies? The ones that traced back to Delaware?" I held up the letter. Apparently, they were connected to similar operations in 2 other states. The Nevada Attorney General would like to discuss some adjacent parcels that might have similar title problems. "How many parcels?" "Enough to constitute an entire town." Marlo's expression shifted into something I recognized. The same look Clara used to get when she spotted an injustice that needed correcting. "So what are you waiting for?" she asked. I looked at my daughter, then at the lake, then at the mountains that had watched over this land for millennia. Clara's voice echoed in my memory, as clear as the day she first said it. Power is not about controlling others. It is about having the strength to protect what matters. Cordelia had power, money, connections, an empire built on fear and fraud. She used all of it to crush anyone who threatened her control. I had a cabin, a daughter, and the truth. Sometimes, that is enough. "I am not waiting," I said, folding the letter and sliding it into my pocket. "I am just getting started." The sun was setting over Silvervale Lake, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere across the valley, a family was sitting down to dinner in a home they no longer feared losing. Somewhere else, a former victim was rebuilding a life that had been stolen from them. Somewhere, justice was being served one document at a time. If this story teaches anything, it is this: people like Cordelia exist everywhere. They build systems designed to take from others and protect themselves from consequences. They count on silence. They depend on fear, but they are not invincible. The truth, carefully documented and strategically deployed, can bring down even the most entrenched corruption. All it takes is one person willing to fight back. Marlo appeared beside me on the dock, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Nevada," she said thoughtfully. That is going to be a bigger fight. Probably. More dangerous. Almost certainly. She nodded once with the decisive certainty that reminded me so much of her mother. Good. When do we leave? I put my arm around my daughter's shoulders, and together we watched the stars emerge over Silvervale Lake. The first chapter was finished, but the story was far from over. Soon, I said. Very soon. Somewhere in Nevada, the truth was waiting to be uncovered, and we were going to find it. If Stetson's victory gave you satisfaction, let us know in the comments. And make sure you are subscribed, because as Marlo said, Nevada is going to be a much bigger fight. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.
Thanks for staying to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to IS Stories.